Hello, everybody. Lenny, Della, Rocca, and Michael O'Meara with the South Florida Poetry Journal here at Miami Book Fair with Richard Blanco. Richard, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks, Lenny.
Um, you, of course, we all know you as a poet, but you got a book here of interviews that you're in, writing hard stories.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about what that's all about?
Well, it's kind of an anthology of various profiles. They're not quite interviews because they're really also from the editor, Melanie, has sort of take on the relationships she's had with these authors from afar. So there's a great sort of, it's a very different, it's not a straight up, interview, which can be boring sometimes.
Exactly, right.
That she sort of gives an overview of some of the work and just did interview us, but just sort of uses snippets. And it's really about, how do we negotiate those hard stories in terms of memoir and the different ways in which the processes that different authors go through. And they're each unique, and yet they all have some certain things in common.
Sure.
But just seeing, because I think one of the hardest things of writing memoir is like core emotional stuff that we got to deal with. And how to tell the story and how to get away from the story too at the same time.
Right. It's interesting that I read a little bit of it and had a chance to read the whole thing, but you mentioned something along the lines of, in your poetry, you had dealt with a lot of these things that you had written in the memoir, but in the memoir you get to unpack a lot of the stuff that you couldn't really get into in the poetry, just simply because poetry is a different animal. Yeah,
I think, by the time I started writing the memoir, I had 3 books of poetry, and I could kind of, I just started writing that because I wanted to write a memoir, but I was just curious to see, as I say, what my life or what my story would look like without line breaks, and see, just sort of from a genuine sort of intellectual and creative curiosity. And what I discovered along the way was that it kind of was fairly easy to write in from the perspective of that I had done so much of the emotional work in the poetry.
Right.
And so I kind of knew what the arc would be. I kind of had processed some of that. But the poetry, there was a lot of backstory, like about my grandmother, who was a real larger-than-life character in my life. I mean, poetry can only hold so much humor, So there's so many just places to dive into. And it's like, in a way, it's like the memoir was just like add water to the poem and watch it blow up, and focusing on the story versus just the emotional core, which is what a poem does, right? And does it in a very wonderful way. So I feel like I learned how to play the same song but on a different instrument, and it has a different effect, right?
Yeah,
for me,
that's a great way of saying it. Yeah. You also said in here that the city of Miami, or Miami itself, was not so much a character, but your experience of it was a character in the memoir. Talk a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, I really felt like part of what I wanted to do, particularly in one long chapter, which is called Queen of the Copa, which is about an experience of being a young kid in South Beach before it was SoBe. Back with, with the verandas full of retirees. And the really rich Jewish community. And I tried, and even my town, my area where I grew up in Westchester, or Westchester, which was, has changed. So much of Miami has changed. So since it's a memoir from the time I was 7 to 17, part of what I wanted to do is sort of be almost like a city historian, and get into or at least the emotional history of what it felt like, to live in South Beach or be in South Beach in 1980 or late 70s. So that people have a sense that, this place wasn't always like this, and it might not be the same 20 years from now, but sort of to record that in a way that was part of what I wanted to do, was to give people a window into another time in Miami. And including the physical landscapes, and talking about Lincoln Road, when it was just like kind of an eerie, quiet place, and there's just a few wig shops, but it was important to me. I always consider myself also an emotional historian, whether a poet or a memoirist, and that was kind of scary in a way too, because then all of Miamians became sort of someone I was writing about indirectly, and I had to do a lot of research. Was there really a Wolfies on that? That's I remember, because I thought people in Miami would call me on things like, "That's not the way it was." Or, we didn't feel that way about Miami, or
Wolfies wasn't there; it was down on the other street.
Or how dare you say that about Westchester? Or and actually, most people, especially from Westchester, all my grade school classmates, they were so honored that and to that I wrote about our lives in a way, directly about theirs, and I think they were able to see the specialness of our years there, and see the uniqueness as we all hopefully come to appreciate our childhood and adolescence in different ways, and our parents and the environments we grew up, and the neighborhood. Because I always say Miami, still in a way, is really very villagey, and it's very community based. And I grew up in a community. I didn't grow up in a huge city, although it was all around me. I grew up in a community, and I think I'm all the better for it.
Your roots, of course, are from Cuba. Talk a little bit about how that has come into play, whether it was poetry or the memoir or what.
Yeah, it's always, I mean, it's, as I like to say, it was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported in the United States. I've been trying to shake that, but it's just, it always gets a laugh.
So you spent time in Spain then?
Well, I was born in Spain, so my mom left 7 months pregnant from Cuba, so I was conceived in Cuba, so my soul was made in Cuba. And then they emigrated to Spain, to Madrid first, where I was born, and 45 days after my birth, we moved to New York City. Or I was moved.
Yes.
And then he moved to Miami when I was about 4. So by the time I was 4, I belonged to. Well, by the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries: Cuba, Spain, United States. Had lived in 4 cities, you know, well, three cities. So the question of home always became, was already with me, the obsession of trying to understand what home and belonging and place and identity mean. And then jump into Miami, which of course it's its own unique social cultural experiment, right? And growing up in a very, very Cuban exile community, right? Where I wasn't different. I was part of. I was the majority of how our community was, and Cuba was this other place in my mind, in my parents' mind, places that felt real and yet sort of completely imaginary because I'd never been there. And then the United States also felt, or you know, the America I saw on TV and in history books and in commercials, and also felt like this place that I hadn't been to, or that it wasn't. It was like another kind of Cuba. It's this place that I don't really know, but know. And so, basically, a lot of my work, especially the early work, was about negotiating those spaces between those 2 real imagined worlds, and thinking about not just cultural identity, but really ultimately it's the universal desire that we all have to find a sense of home and belonging and place. And it's an obsession, as I always say, or someone has said, you know, a writer or a poet is writing one poem or one story all their life, and and what that means that somehow the body of work always comes back to this central obsession, a question that really has no answer. First, like, is asking what is home is like asking what is love, right?
Exactly.
So, even to this day, it's evolved in different ways.
Branches off the same tree.
But it's always, no matter, sometimes I think I'm writing about something, I look back and the theme is like, oh, here it is, home again. My latest book, which is kind of, it's not a trade publication, it's a fine press book, and it's with a photographer. It's called Boundaries. And it's, it's still about the question of home, but home on a much larger sort of idea of what is home, what is America, right? Much more Whitman-esque.
Is it poetry?
It's poetry with photographs, not my photographs. Jacob Hessler, who's a photographer. But it's they're kind of paired, but they're really I'm not writing about the photographs. A lot of them are like prompts to write about sort of historical or current issues that we have in terms of boundaries, not just national boundaries or nation boundaries, but boundaries of race, gender, all these narratives that have perpetuate our separation artificially. So sort of, I'm still asking, it's still about home, not just whether it's Cuban or, but it's like, what is home in terms, what is the United States, right? So it's still those same questions, is sort of another.
Well, because everything evolves and changes, and these days especially, quickly. The photographs are in a particular place. Are they Miami? Are they Cuba?
They're all over the country. There's a photo, for example, of Angel Island in the West Coast, which is like the Ellis Island of the West Coast, where most, if not all, Chinese, of the era, Chinese immigration happened. One example is another photo from the Navajo Nation. So that poem talks about the Navajo Long Walk. Another one of Hallandale Beach here in Florida, which is where most of the rafters land because of the currents. So that was a poem connected to
Sure.
Cuba and
Right.
that boundary, which is a big conversation.
Absolutely.
So yeah, they're all over the country, not over the world, but it was really based on thinking about America,
Right.
you know, and its boundaries. Of course, the Rio Grande
Right.
and other more.
Right. Do you have the book here, or do you have a?
No, I
You
have
don't?
to because it's literally
Because
hot.
I don't have one,
It's
and I
hot.
thought if you did, you could read a poem. But
It's hot off the presses,
is
like
it?
literally, like.
Okay.
But it's also fine press book, like they're numbered, and there's
Oh,
only,
really?
yeah, it's
Okay.
only 300. So it's really like buying an art piece versus
Cool.
a book.
Yeah.
So, but we hope to do a trade publication in the next year
Okay.
for the market.
Yeah.
And that's part of what.
Sure.
Well, this is an aside.
Sort of like a
You'll
specialty
edit.
thing.
This doesn't really matter,
Right.
but just so you know,
Right.
it's it's like it's an expensive book because it's
Sure. There's
it's
only
a
so
fine
many.
press.
Yeah.
And I've learned this whole thing. There's a subculture of publishing that book collectors and
Yeah.
libraries and books like $300, and it's the cheapest book they've ever made.
Wow.
But yeah, it's with
Yeah.
a slip cover.
Well, I'll
it's
pick up
like,
a few.
it's
Yeah.
like it's like for the collector,
Yes.
the person the bibliophile
Yes.
that really see, they just like the book,
Yeah.
And so it's kind of neat, but we hope to do a trade soon,
Cool.
so that it can be shared
Yeah.
in a different way.
So you, I don't know if maybe you've already answered this, but you've not been to Cuba at all, or have you been?
No, I've been to Cuba. First trip was in 1994.
Okay.
And I've kind of gone every 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 or 5 years ever since then.
Where's your folks from there, or your mom?
They are, well, that's kind of the name of the first book, actually, because it's City of 100 Fires, but in Spanish it's Cienfuegos.
Yes.
That's
the name of it.
first
Okay.
book.
Okay.
So they're from that area, in and around that area, which is a town, not a town, it's a fairly medium-sized city, sort of
Okay.
southeast from Havana on the southern coast.
Okay. Because my wife is from Camagüey.
Yeah, no, that's way,
That's the
and
different
I've
area.
never visited.
I think that's more center of the island. I think. Yeah.
I mean, Cuba is a huge island.
Yeah.
I've only seen 1/5 of
Yeah.
it. It's
Yeah.
like, and plus when I go see family, so
Sure.
you're kind of like,
Right.
but yeah, I've been going ever since, and it's always a different experience and different things are
Right,
happening. And the last experience I had in Cuba was, of course, writing and then reading the poem for the reopening of the U.S. Embassy, which was like an incredible experience. It was another kind of inauguration. One that in a weird way was even more frightening and in a good way, and so much more personal. So it's like, but getting back to the question of home is really, it's funny how it just slips away from you. Just when I thought I was Mr. Joe America, I read a poem at the presidential inauguration. I even told my mom, I guess we're finally Americans.
Yeah.
And then, like, almost 2 years to the date, this whole thing happens with Cuba. And those questions of like, well, maybe am I supposed to maybe live in? Am I supposed to be this now?
Right.
And I think what I decided from those two experiences, and from that contrast, was just that thinking I don't have to pick, and I always thought I had to pick one or the other. And thinking of myself more as a global citizen now.
Sure.
And thinking about because it's really what the world's becoming.
I was just going to say.
Boundary-less, even though the politicians and everybody else keep on feeding us this idea of narrative, of these dividing narratives.
Boundaries.
But these boundaries, really, we're becoming the other narrative that's being written, organically and by itself, is a world of connected and
homogenous sort of. Yeah.
Which is weird because it's scary, because homogenization it's great, but it's also, I think the challenge of the next generation is how do we celebrate individuality and diversity while still acknowledging that it's not it's celebrating. It's not about drawing lines in the sand, and it's really about realizing that in some sense we're all at one time going to be one biologically,
one big round world, but because it forces folks to face the other, right? Not so much now as it was, 20, 30, 50 years ago, of course, but
where you could live in a more isolated space. And like some of my students in Miami is like a perfect example of it. Some of my students at FIU, they're like from Honduras, and the fathers from China, and grandmothers from India. They have these incredible stories, and they're an example of how the world's just connected in ways, and it's scary to some, because in a way it's being homogenized means sort of, or feels like you're losing your identity of
Exactly.
the self.
Right.
That's what we got to figure out. How do we do that?
Yeah, you don't want to lose it all the way because there's so many great things.
Right.
There's so many good ingredients in the pie. You don't want to lose it for the whole. You know,
right.
you don't
Exactly.
want to. Yeah.
Exactly.
I can't let you go without talking about the inauguration,
Oh,
the
sure.
poem. You know, because I watched it as millions did. And I thought, yes, you know, our own, you know, Miami or South Florida guy is up there, and it was just fantastic. It was just so sweeping and epic. How the hell did you do that?
Well, I still don't. I still wake
Yeah.
up sometimes and go, exactly that. How the hell did I do that? I ask myself that. You know, it's really interesting because I think part of everything we're talking about, in a way, is in the poem.
Yeah, yeah, sure is.
It's that idea of, you know, what is home to us,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
trying to define that. In a way, I wanted that poem was so reminiscent. I said I wanted, you know,
Yeah.
I wanted everyone to sort of come home
Inclusive
together and
yeah.
like think about how we're individual, but how we're all tied and connected, and
Yeah.
really one part of one larger sort of psychic family, right?
It
You know,
certainly
or at
was.
least that's the way we should be. You know, that's the ideal. You know,
I was just going to
that's
say,
the idea,
ideally,
moving
that's
towards that
yeah.
ideal. Of course, we're in a very different place right now, and
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
I'm not sure that we were. I think this is part of growing. But anyway,
Yeah.
besides all that,
Do you remember any lines from it?
From my poem,
I hate to put you on the spot.
it's funny. I've only read it like about 300 times, but
Right.
I've never been one to memorize.
We'll cut
poems,
that part out if you don't remember.
No,
No, all right,
I'll
good
mess
enough.
up. But
Good enough.
And I heard you had to write more than one.
Yeah.
You had to submit more than one.
I had to write three poems in 3 weeks. So
Whoa, wow.
But the poem itself became, you know, a poem asks is a way of asking questions of oneself,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes what people don't, or what I learned at least, in terms of writing occasional poems, that people sometimes, poets feel that the occasional poem is about the occasion,
Yeah.
and it is, but they don't also understand it's just about it should be just as much about you and your emotions and connected to this, that it's okay to be personal and occasional poem, and I am. I mentioned my mother, my father.
Sure.
So, like, there's a line, you know, it says, as you know, to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem for us today. You know, like,
Yeah.
And you know, it's like I'm one of the people in the poem. I'm not just this talking
Absolutely.
head. And it was really an exploration of where I feel am in this landscape. Where is America home? Because
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest questions that I had to ask myself, which I was avoiding during the 3 weeks I had,
Sure.
I had to face that even though at 44 that I was back then, I really wasn't sure that I was still American. I really wasn't sure that I belonged to the narrative. I really wasn't sure if I still needed to be Peter Brady or Marsha Brady. You know, I didn't know if I loved this
Yeah.
country in that way.
Sure.
You know, because you kind of hear, but you always have Cuba, and there's this weird.
Yeah.
And that poem made me realize that, you know, my narrative as a chubby little gay kid who grew up in a suburb in Westchester, Miami, that is the American narrative, or a grand part of it. Not
Sure.
My mother's story as a Cuban exile who grew up in a dirt floor home in Cuba. That is part of the American narrative. Narratives that have been ignored, either consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
But I got and narratives of people like that, like me, and a million others, stories similar. People that felt they were always in the margins,
Yeah.
or have been made to feel that way.
Okay.
And I had the honor of sort of representing indirectly all those others,
Sure.
in that moment, and that
culminated to that one point in that place at that time.
Yeah, and that's what the poem is really about.
Yeah.
It's just like, let's look at all our faces. And there's another line in there that I love. It just says, my face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. So that idea that, you know, all those people, all as we go about our day, all those little narratives Because in a way, a nation is nothing but a bunch of small little villages, right?
Absolutely.
A community again, which
Sure.
is what I always come back to, how I grew up in Miami,
Exactly.
and it's what makes us feel. It's what makes us feel grounded and ourselves, our truest selves.
I also think what's significant for me, and I think for probably millions and millions of people, as whose inauguration this was.
Right.
You know, this was Barack Obama's inauguration. It was the second inauguration, right? The second
Yes,
one?
the second. Yeah.
And you know, and that just, to me, that just was so sort of like a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Because it was, you know, the first black president, and here you are up reading this sweeping epic poem about this whole thing that you're talking about, this whole homogenous, inclusive sort of Whitman-esque, you know, embrace of of this nation, of this country. And there you were out, you know, reading, looking out at this huge crowd. I get, were you you had to have been nervous. Were you nervous?
I wasn't, because I mean, not that I don't have nerves of steel, and I'm not that arrogant. It was a good kind of nervous, but I wasn't as nervous as I thought it would be, mostly because I was swept up myself in this moment and realizing this is so much bigger than me. This is bigger than the president. This is bigger than Beyonce that was there, you know. It really, there's a palpable sense of how sacred that moment is, and it's like every time that happens, it's like America renews its vows, almost like a wedding. And I think screw the 4th of July. I mean, that is just really defines America. Like, you can feel it, like, and just the, you know, I think, you know, there's over 1 million people. I always wondered, why the hell do people go to these inaugurations and they're called? And it's the power of witness, and what they're saying indirectly, even though they're Obama, you know, supporters and fanatics, right? What they're saying indirectly is at the heart of what this country of democracy was based on. And it's what they're saying is, it's the witness is saying, you're there because we're here, and don't forget it.
Exactly.
You have a responsibility to all these people. You know, we're not here to crown. It's not about crowning the queen or the king. And there's an indirect saying, you know, we're here to make sure you face us, right?
Exactly.
And I mean, indirectly,
sure,
I think it's that statement, because it's really a celebration of the United States and the people, and so that the ego took a back, you know, a back seat, because it's just like this, you know, the ego's the one that wants to make it all about you and be perfect, you know, like, and do all that, and then just I was swept up in the moment, and then I chose to have my mother sit right next to me. We had other guests, but on a platform you could only have one guest, and just to see this be that story that she started in a way. Just something so much bigger, you know, don't get me wrong, I mean, it was a little harsh, but not as much as I would. Well, it was really interesting because a lot of people in Miami reached out to me, and before and during and after, and one of the greatest surprises was Gloria Stefan, which, you know, to me, you know, as you know, she was our first Cuban American, like, you know, idol's not even the right role model, you know, like something. I said, well, she made it, we can do something. And I'll never forget, because the first time I applied to FIU writing program, I got rejected because I basically wrote my first 10 poems and handed them in. But they gave me some feedback, and they said, we want you to take classes and see if you evolve a little bit, because we see some potential. And I thought about Gloria Stefan in the sense when she was just playing at, you know, Quince's parties and at high schools. And I always thought, what if she would have given up, right? How beautiful. So anyway, she reached out to me, and she said, when you get up on that podium, something to this, when you get up the podium, she said, like, look out. Don't run away from that moment. Embrace it. Just take it all in, because it's one of those things that's only going to happen once. And if you look at the video, I remembered what she sent, the message she sent, and I was just like, I took my moment, like a second or two, to just look at the crowd and say, and so that puts me in this way. And of course, she's talking to me as an artist that, you know, you know, performs in front of hundreds, tens of thousands of people, right? So she knows what she's talking about. And she says, enjoy it. Like, just enjoy it. Savor it. Don't run away from it. Don't run away from it.
Well, you did great.
Thank
I mean,
you. Thank you.
you did great. I mean, it's a remarkable bookmark in the history of this country because it was history.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of rejections, you said you got rejected the first time you applied to FIU. Do you still get rejection? Do you send stuff out and people do they say I'm going to reject Richard Blanco here? I'm going to send him a rejection letter.
Well,
what's going on?
You know, I've never been one to. I've been bad at. I'm always bad about sending to journals, and
Yeah.
I kind of picked up a little trick that actually my mentor taught me. Wait till the manuscript gets slated for publication, and then you send out to everybody, and the turnaround time is like one day, and
Gotcha.
they'll still reject you.
Yeah.
But well, you know, it's scary because what happens now is like not just rejection, but it's also now that there's a spotlight.
Yeah.
You know,
they're asking you to send stuff.
Yeah. And then you're also like on the spotlight. So like if you write a poem or something that's not, you know, you can't just you can't. How can I say? You're not cut a lot of slack at this point, right? But mostly what I've been doing that's exciting and keeps me writing and is sort of this whole. Actually, the inauguration also changed my whole sense of what poetry's place in America and what it can be, and it's given me a whole another kind of sense of mission and direction for my work. Not only what I'm writing about, but also what I want to do as a poet in the United States. So I've been doing a lot of poems for, like, for example, Boston Strong, which was I read at the Boston Marathon after the marathon bombing at the benefit concert.
Right.
I opened, as I say, for Steven Tyler, which is, we opened it with a poem, and it was, you could hear a pin drop, not because I'm that great a poet. People wanted poetry. Yeah. You know, they expected, it wasn't like, I mean, and this is Boston, okay?
Yeah,
like, this is the Tea Garden. I'm like thinking there's just going to be, hey, buddy, get on the move. Like, we want to see, you know, we want to see our boy Steve. Yeah, like, it was like a prayer. So things like that, commission poems, I would call them commission poems. They're not really poems that won a poem for Pulse that I wrote. So sometimes it's more formal, like Freedom to Mary asked me to write a poem to commemorate their 10-year anniversary, and they used it verbatim as the script for a short film they did. Right. Which just came out beautiful with the job that they did with the film. So that's kept me, and boundaries. So like that was in a way an assignment. So those kinds of things have kept me writing. But I still have, you know, so I don't get rejected per se, but I still have my writing buddies from FIU. And
do you? Okay, good.
Yeah, they let me have it.
All right, good.
They like,
you know, let you get away with it.
Like, what is that stanza doing? Get it out of there. What's that crap? You know?
Good.
So I still have 2 or 3 from the days of grad school that are that. So I get rejected in that. I get home. Poets, you know, you can't get to it. You get humbled very quickly.
I have one last question, and this is a lighthearted question.
Sure.
Lennon or McCartney?
Or who?
McCartney. Lennon or McCartney?
McCarthy or
Lennon or McCartney?
Oh, okay.
John Lennon or Paul McCartney?
I'm thinking Lennon or McCarthy, like as in Russia.
No, oh yeah, okay, gotcha. Yeah, I can see that.
I heard
No,
Lennon McCartney.
John Lennon or Paul
McCartney. I think Paul McCartney.
I
don't know why.
Richard, thank you so much.
My pleasure. That was fun.